Welcome to the Eating at a Meeting podcast. I'm your host, Tracy Stuckrath, dietary needs expert, certified meetings manager, certified food protection manager. I have searched the globe to find people and businesses who are creating safe, sustainable, and inclusive food and beverage experiences for their employees, guests, and communities. In each episode, you will find authentic conversations about how food and beverage impacts inclusion, sustainability, culture, community, health, and wellness. I know that sounds like a lot, but we're going to cover it all. Are you ready to feed engagement, nourish inclusion, and bolster your bottom line? If so, let's go. Hello, I'm Tracy Stuckrath with Thrive Meetings and Events, and you are at the Eating at a Meeting podcast that I do weekly. So welcome everyone who's here to join me today. With Eating in a Meeting, we talk all things food and beverage. And if you've been listening before, I've interviewed chefs and farmers and doctors and eaters. And today's guest, I'm bringing a little bit different twist on it, is about compliance and ethics. And we're going to talk about how compliance and ethics mesh, meld, whip up together in the workplace and at events and meetings. And you might think that compliance and ethics just relates to, making the food, food manufacturers, but it has a whole nother level of what it means when we're creating events and we're, hosting employees or sending food home to employees while we're in COVID, in our workplace. So I'm excited to have retired bank executive and corporate director, Keith Darcy with us. He has been an educator for 45 years, including associate dean at Georgetown and 25 years on the faculty of the Wharton School. He's involved in shaping the ethics and compliance process for over 40 years and across 60 continents. So I think he's got a little bit of knowledge about what we're going to talk about today, and I'm excited to welcome him. Hello, Keith. How are you?
Good, Tracy. How you doing?
I'm good, thanks. On this semi-cool fall day, it's beautiful outside. So before we get started, I want to educate people on what exactly is corporate compliance and ethics. And is compliance different than ethics? And why is it important to follow compliance and ethics?
Okay, great question. Good starting point. So compliance is acquiescing or yielding to an external authority. Compliance is all about laws and regulations and maybe even company policy. Are people complying with what's been set out as a standard by some enforcement authority, either in the law or even in the company? Ethics, though, are the extra legal things that we need to pay attention to. We can't write laws that cover every circumstance in every corner of the earth at every age of time. So there has to be this greater sense of awareness about what's right and wrong, what's good or bad, what's in or out. And that's the ethical component. Ethics, I've long said, by the way, is how we choose and how we respond to everyday situations that confront us. And the way we express our choices is both through what we do, but also what we don't do. Because when we don't do something, we've chosen not to do it. We need to understand that. No one is amoral or uncommitted. So when people act out of choice, that's ethics. But when people out of compliance, people are not acting out of choice. They're acting out of the responsibility that they have to. So that's a kind of a simple way to talk about ethics and compliance.
And okay, so in the meetings industry, a couple of years ago, and two ways to bring this in is I heard the term duty of care, and it was brought up by a woman who works for American Express and talking about the duty of care that meeting professionals have, and in ordering flights for individuals, making sure that we're putting people up in the right hotels in safe spaces and things like that. Is duty of care separate from compliance and ethics, or is that rolled into all of that as well?
No, it's considered a fiduciary obligation of boards of directors, for one, and I've sat on a couple of national bank boards, but also senior executives and others. And so there's really three principles that are interrelated: duty of care, duty of loyalty to the organization and the people, and duty of good faith, that you're acting out of good faith. So,
Okay.
yeah, those are defined in the law for certain fiduciary obligations, and it really is as much a responsibility under the ethics umbrella rather than just the compliance umbrella.
Okay. And when we talk about compliance and ethics, a couple of years ago, I was hired by a company to help them launch their code of conduct.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of what, and to be honest with you, I used to work for a corporation and I really don't remember it really being touted and pushed out. Here are our code of conducts. But this company, in the healthcare field was, by law needed to make sure all of their employees knew their code of conduct and what that meant. And so we did a celebration during Corporate Compliance and Ethics Week, which actually is this week. So,
yeah, that's right.
Right. So that's the way organizations typically get the information out about their compliance and ethics. Am I right in that?
Sure. So companies write codes of ethics, codes of compliance, codes of good conduct. It covers a lot of legal issues, but it also should cover a lot of non-legal issues, extra legal issues as you go through it. And that's one of the documents that kind of sets the standard down for both regulations as well as company policies, as well as the ethical content of these organizations. In order to reinforce it, to your point, you've got to do training and education. People have to have an understanding of what those sections of the code mean. But it also gets to the issue of culture. How do you embed a culture of compliance, a culture of ethics in an organization? One thing we've learned over time is that culture is by far the single biggest determinant of behavior in every organization in the world. Absolutely, unequivocally, bar none. Culture drives behavior. And so we need to pay attention to that. And so if you're looking to join an organization, you want to know what their code says. That's good. You might want to ask the interviewer, how would you describe the culture at this organization? I think that's important for people, is to get a sense of, what drives them as they go forward. And then what's the tone at the top executive, CEO, other members of senior management. But equally important is what's the tone in the middle? Because if you're not paying attention to the tone in the middle, it'll never reach the plant floor. It'll never reach the bottom of the organization. So we often talk about tone at the top, mood in the middle, and buzz at the bottom. And it's got to be all layers in the organization that form a culture in the organization. The code is a very important element of that, though.
All right. So since we're talking about eating, now we're talking about eating at meetings or just food and beverage in general, how does, besides a manufacturer that's providing, creating a food and packaging it and sending it off somewhere, where does food and beverage compliance and ethics meld together? I'm trying to come up with some word that mixes with food, but how do they work together, and how should we think about it differently?
So when you take a look at the FDA and what they put forth to organizations under their jurisdiction, it's very similar to the world that I work in, which is corporate compliance and ethics. And so let me start on my world, and then I'll reflect it in the FDA world.
Okay.
So the ethics profession as an organized profession was born around 1991, November 1st, 1991, to be specific. And a little known organization out of Washington called the U.S. Sentencing Commission issued Chapter 8 of the Federal Sentencing Guidelines. And their mission has been for all these years to issue to the federal courts the range of sentences on federal crimes. So the same sentence is given on the East Coast, West Coast, North or South, male or female, white or black. They're trying to equalize, create something that is equity. And so on November 1st, 1991, they issued Chapter 8 of the Federal Sentencing Guidelines, which pertains to crimes in the workplace. And this is very important. It raised two new risks. And this goes with the FDA as well. Risk number one is a personal threat. Risk number two is a corporate threat. The personal threat says that executives are subject to civil and/or criminal charges when an employee of theirs commits crimes in the workplace. Whether they knew about it, whether they participated in the crime, may be irrelevant. Willful blindness is not a defense. And in those instances, the corporate threat can kick in, and you could be subject to mandatory fines up to hundreds of millions of dollars. But they did something very creative in 1991. They said if you institute an effective ethics and compliance program, you can reduce, mitigate, or eliminate those risks. And they even spelled out in 1991 what has become the global gold standard for ethics and compliance programs. So it begins with periodic risk assessments. FDA requires that. What are the risks of your organization? Once you've identified them, you should rate them according to the highest risks and lowest risks. What kind of policies and procedures and mitigations do you put in place to address those risks? There must be a high-level person that's responsible for implementing a program to reduce those risks. That person must have appropriate authority and adequate resources to get her job done. That's a fiduciary obligation of the board of directors in my book. There must be training and communication, including the governing authority, the board of directors. There must be an internal mechanism. We used to call them hotlines. Today we call them helplines, where employees can speak up in confidence and say, we see something that will impact our organization. And periodically, you must evaluate the effectiveness of what you're doing. And so that's all spelled out by the federal sentencing guideline. Well, the FDA has similar language. All the enforcement authorities are sharing these levels of information with each other. And this has now happened on a global basis as well. Okay. So we're seeing a whole step forward of how do we manage risks? How do we reduce the risks of malfeasance and corruption and other things in organizations? And the same goes for anybody in the food chain, from manufacturers, suppliers, to distributors, to wholesalers, to retailers. It becomes very important.
And that, I think, also goes down even further into the food, what I call the event food chain, is to the hotel and the chef that works at that hotel or convention center, and even to the event manager that works at the hotel, but also the event manager that is planning that event. I think they have that responsibility as well, that duty of care and ethics to maintain.
That gets back to your fiduciary obligation, by the way, that duty of care that you talk about.
Right.
And so you do have that responsibility. It's interesting. I ran an organization, nonprofit membership organization, for a number of years, and we ran multiple events every year, as you've been involved in and so forth. And as the CEO of that organization, I never thought once about the food. Now, other people that work for me, hopefully were doing that, but until I became aware of and sensitive to food allergy issues, I never thought of it. And looking back, I hope, and even today, sometimes I travel across country and I call the airline, make my ticket plans, and they send me an email. Do you have any food allergies or food sensitivities? And I'll write back and say, yeah, type 2 diabetes. And I get on the plane and they give me sugar, they give me carbohydrates, they give me, things I can't eat. I mean, I shouldn't be eating. So, do we know what people need for their respective food issues, which are multiple? It's not just food allergies of some kind or type 2 diabetes. It's a whole bunch of other things. So,
yeah, that's a shame that airline, I mean, a majority of them do have sometimes an option for that, but the fact that that's what they provided with that is not a good, not a good option. Something you said, two things that you said is, I'm going to jump on the food when you became aware about food allergies. So I know that story, how you became aware, but can you tell me, what made you more aware of food allergies, and what was that transition, I guess, in becoming more aware and understanding?
Sure. So I've gone through several iterations. There was a turning point, which I'll get to, and I know where you're going with this. But for years, I've been teaching ethics and compliance at Wharton, at Georgetown, et cetera. And I've always made reference to a best-selling book in 1906 by a socialist by the name of Upton Sinclair called The Jungle, as one of those steps in the evolution of compliance. And when Sinclair wrote this book, he was trying to call attention to the horrific working conditions in the Chicago meat markets. But what the American public read was, we're eating mad cow disease. And it wasn't until I became aware of food issues that I look back on Upton Sinclair's book and now say, oh yeah, it was a food issue. I had another turning point about food, which was on 9/11 in 2001. And my office was downtown. I witnessed the whole thing firsthand. I saw the second jet fly across the Hudson, slam into the South Tower. My brother died in the North Tower. But what I wound up doing in the aftermath of that was buy breakfast, lunch, and dinner for my employees for months because it wasn't safe to go outside. And I somehow intuitively knew that food was a connector. So keeping people safe was the most important thing I could do, both physically as well as emotionally. And food, as we say, we sit around the table. The food is on the back burner in the old expression. So then in 2005, I get appointed by the Institute of Medicine of the National Academies to a special blue ribbon commission on marketing and the effects on childhood obesity. And it was a who's who of nutritionists and scientists, and how the heck I got into it, I have no idea. But I was there to be the ethicist, to tell you the truth. But what we wound up doing was convening hearings. We subpoenaed companies to come in and talk to us. You know, why do you have all these figures that are aimed at, and commercials that are aimed at children for these high sugar content foods and other foods that are not good for you? And I think around that time, the whole statement of good for you foods began to come out as a result. And so I'm not going to name any names here, but the biggest turning point for me was about 2006. So our first grandchild, Miles, my daughter's son, has food allergies, peanuts, tree nuts, among other things, which can be fatal. And I quickly became the rationally ignorant grandparent. I didn't want responsibility for reading the back of food labels because I didn't want to be responsible for his well-being, for his life and death issues. So if we were with Miles alone, I'd ask my wife to do it. With Erin, she knows all about this. She's become an expert in this field. But it really bothered me that, you know, I wasn't involved. But I knew this intellectually. I didn't know this emotionally until Erin and her family were featured in a Discovery Channel program. And I watched this program and it hit me emotionally. I realized how dangerous this world is that people with life-threatening food allergies in particular feel. And so, and then my wife and I remember one time we were vacationing with the family, Erin's family, down in Kiowa Island, and Miles might have been 7 years old. So my wife and I are driving around with him, and we're talking about his food allergies and how he feels about it. And he said, Nanny, Baba, he said, my problem is I can't afford to be right 75% of the time. I have to be right 100% of the time. Man, that blew my mind. That's how dangerous that world is. So that's then I become a type 2 diabetic, and my numbers were off the chart. And I can't understand that happened because I grew up eating the tops of Entenmann's crumb cake all the time. I was just, anything that was bad for me, I loved. So, so I had to manage my type 2 diabetes. And how do I do that? I go on the Atkins diet, very low carbs, no sugars. Of course, I cheat now and then, if not more often than that, but that's a different story. But that's been my orientation to food allergies. And I had an episode when I was in high school where I ate half of a strawberry shortcake. And the next day at school, I broke out all over my face. And so I bought a daily newspaper. I got on the bus. I went home half day. I was embarrassed. I had, red spots all over me. And when you speak about food allergies, my initial impression is you break out in hives. No, it's a lot more severe than that. It can be life-threatening. And so that's kind of been my evolution of this. And I still don't consider myself an expert. I leave that to my daughter, Erin, who is an expert, and people like you, Tracy. But it's a scary world out there.
Okay, so Miles's statement, and Erin has told me that statement before. It's heart-wrenching because you have to be right. He has to be right 100% of the time. Right. And 75% is not going to cut it. And even 99% of the time is not going to cut it. But if you're going to a corporate meeting or you're going to a convention center, those people who are making the food or those people who are ordering the food, a meeting planner, we have to be right 100% of the time so Miles doesn't die.
That's
or
right.
get sick.
Yep.
And I think that's the hard part to swallow, like you said, because I think as meeting professionals and, or even hoteliers or restaurateurs and things like that, is like you said, I'm blissfully, well, I don't know if blissfully ignorant, because
Rationally
when you
ignorant.
when you don't understand, or you don't take the time to recognize what you do, what responsibility you do have, you are putting yourself at risk, I think, even more so knowing it and knowing what you're supposed to do and disregarding it.
Yeah,
Right.
it's true. It's totally true. And I've got to rely on other people to be the experts in this case. I know every time Miles comes over, we have to take the peanut butter and, just park it someplace where nobody can reach it, because it's not just ingesting the food. It can be in the air. It can be in the flour of something baked as a cake or whatever it may be. And therefore you have to rely on labeling. Well, what if you have mislabeling that takes place? Or it doesn't prominently display that we've changed the way we produce this product, which yesterday was safe for people like Miles, but today is not. And so that's a real issue. It's funny. I was thinking when I woke up this morning, just kind of reflecting on us getting together here. And something came to mind out of my world, which was the Ford Pinto case. And so this goes back many decades ago, but the Pinto had its gas tank in the back of the car. And if there was an accident, the cars blew up and the flames went up and the car was destroyed and people died. And Ford was taken to task, although later absolved of this, for having some internal documents that did a cost-benefit trade-off. And they decided that it was cheaper to pay off the families than it was to change the engineering of the car. Yeah. And so do we have that happening in the food world, where it's cheaper to put in something that can harm people or not change it if it does harm people than change the entire production process? I don't know. But that, to me, that's an ethical issue for sure, at a minimum.
Well, and that reminds me of a story I heard about a caterer who signature dessert was a signature dessert, and the pastry chef knew that somebody had gluten. They had a couple of people with gluten intolerance, and so she or he made that part of the dish with gluten-free flour. Well, a lot of gluten-free flours are nut-based. Well, there was also somebody in that event that had nut allergies, and that pastry chef didn't tell anyone she had changed that. And that person with the nut allergy ended up in the hospital. Because of her lack of due diligence in communicating that, or doing different options. So I think that comes into play with that. But and even in the workplace, I spoke to somebody in the HR at a company that I used to work with a long time ago, and she's like, okay, explain to me what you do. And I said, I'm here. I educate on how to create safe and inclusive food and beverage experiences. And I said, take, for example, you order food from the local deli. And typically that is ham sandwiches, turkey sandwiches, roast beef sandwiches with cheese on them, and pasta salad as the side. And so you've already knocked out your vegans and your vegetarians and your gluten-free and potentially your kosher. And she's like, well, as a type 2 diabetic, I can't eat any of that.
Right. Exactly.
And so she's been now excluded from that event. And she's, one of 3 heads of HR. But she also noted that she couldn't go down into the company cafeteria and get the vegetable soup because that vegetable soup was made with chicken stock.
That's exactly right. Yeah. And what if the boss asks you out to lunch, takes you to a Chinese restaurant, and you're allergic to soy? You're excluded from eating. You just, it's exclusionary. It's very dangerous. I think of Miles. He is so smart, and he knows how to manage his issue. And he'll grill the waiter or the maitre d' or the chef, because he knows, was it made in this? Was it in peanut oil? Whatever it may be. But I read an article not long ago where, for people with allergies that go into restaurants that they're unfamiliar with, it's like playing Russian roulette. You order something, Is there going to be sesame seeds on the bun or whatever it may be?
Right.
It's scary. It really is.
So how can, people in the hospitality industry really grasp this compliance and ethics concept for themselves and for their businesses if they don't have a code of conduct, or they've never seen this, or and then have there been any cases that actually bring to light how this impacts the company if they're not following the compliance and ethics around food and beverage?
Sure.
It's two separate questions, but
but probably the starting point is to think about doing a risk assessment, and whether you're in-house in an organization where it's easier because you can control the risk process, or you're external to it, you're an advisor, you're somebody who's running events for them. You've got to do a risk assessment, number one, and then ask yourself, do they have appropriate mitigations against those risks? One of the things I do as a quote unquote expert is I get up every morning at 5:30 in the morning and I read newspapers from all over the world. I get news feeds from all over the world. My job is to be an expert in my field. And so I'm looking to see what are any new issues popping up, or there are a series of new issues popping up that I need to pay attention to, or do they connect the dots? Is there something emerging here that we need to pay attention to? I have long said now the new frontier for risk is technology. And since I got a D- in Fortran in college right after the Civil War, I don't know anything about technology, but I know that's the new frontier for risk. But that's my job. And so doing a risk assessment, number one, and then asking the company, do we have the mitigations in place to address those risks? And then you have to think of the extra legal risks, which are the ethical risks. And then it gets to the issue of a reputation risk. And that to me is the larger umbrella here, is what is your reputation worth? I often meet with boards of directors, do some board education, and I'll ask the board, do you know what your reputation is worth? And they all look at each other like, what are you talking about? It's got a financial number to it. 5 minutes before I walked into the board meeting, it was $56.5 billion, whatever it was. But there's a market value to your company. And the class example in the food space was a bunch of years ago, not that long, McDonald's and Yum Brands, which owns KFC, among other franchises, had a supplier headquartered in the US, but doing business in China, supplying expired meats, horse meat, etc., which once it was disclosed, and this was not McDonald's or Yum Brands that caused this issue, it was their supplier. But McDonald's, within 2 days, their market capitalization went down by $10 billion.
Wow.
That's called reputation risk. That's called reputation risk. Yep. And that's the world that I deal in, is what could go wrong. So the issue for me, out of my experience, is what can we do in advance to be preventative? It's like anything in healthcare. And because being preventative is a hell of a lot less expensive than responding to the issues after the fact. Then we have to throw lots of money at the issues to, get things done. And, we had Bluebell ice cream recently was cited, for listeria, and it was covered up by the senior executives of the company. The company was fined almost $20 million. CEO and other senior executives going to trial soon. So, these issues are out there. There are personal threats. This is what's going on. And we need to pay attention to all of these issues out there and be responsive to it. And you need an instinct for risk. I've said this for many, many years. It's got to be in your DNA. You've got to wake up like I do every morning, early in the morning, and you read all this news. And I think the whole world's going to go to hell in a handbasket until I have my third cup of coffee and I'm satisfied. We'll probably make it through one more day. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but not a lot. Yeah. That's my job. If you're going to be an effective risk manager, you have to think something's going to go wrong.
Well, and so there's a couple of things that makes me think of. I worked for the Olympics, Atlanta and Vancouver. And I remember sitting in the Vancouver one and we're doing our risk assessment. Okay, well, what happens if a hurricane hits Vancouver? What happens if this happens, earthquake, tsunami, anything like that? Never did we think of pandemic, right? and
Right.
which shut down this year's Olympics. But that was our sort of risk assessment, but we never really talked about food and beverage. And,
Yep.
you mentioned listeria and that other case. I mean, that does impact our food supply. And
Absolutely.
what's happening with the pandemic now, and with the lack of food being able to get to their normal locations of sales, convention
Yep.
centers, hotels, but now it's also not getting to the people because the people aren't at the work and all of that. So that impacts, and that actually it does affect compliance and ethics and how we're doing things with that. But
It
it brings,
absolutely does. Yeah.
yeah, the one now that story just escaped my brain, but Mary Vargas, who is in the that fights for individuals with disabilities, and so she's big in the food allergy world, and her kids, one or two of her kids have food allergies, but she handled a case a couple of years ago for Panera Bread.
Yeah.
And we're talking about culture here.
Right.
There was this employee that had a peanut allergy or nut allergy, and he was being taunted with peanut butter by the locations manager as well as other employees. Hey, we're going to put the peanut butter on your EpiPen. Oh, and here, eat this cookie. It doesn't have any nuts in it.
Right.
And that case settled out of court, and it didn't get the play that McDonald's did, and probably losing its reputation. But the more I talk about it, I'm like, and I'm not going to be blowing up Panera's stock market rates, but that's a story of ethics within the workplace.
Yep. And they had a few issues, by the way, not to condemn them, but so you have to ask yourself, is this pervasive throughout the organization, or is it a couple of one-offs? And in their case, I'm sure it was a couple of one-offs, but I mean, that's the scary thing to me for Miles. Miles is now a sophomore in high school, and we know what high school and college kids can do. They can go over and pick up a jar of peanuts and throw it at you.
Right.
I don't predict they will. I certainly hope they don't, but it's scary. What you also get, Tracy, though, are companies that do it the right way in the supply chain. So I'll use Starbucks as a good example. And it has nothing to do with food allergies, but Starbucks has a very strict auditing process of their suppliers, that they have certain standards that they want their suppliers to adhere to for the Starbucks brand, the Starbucks product. It becomes their brand. Culture and brand, by the way, are flip sides of the same coin. Culture is internal, brand is external. And so Starbucks goes out and sends teams of auditors, and they will pay a premium price for their supply from their suppliers if it meets their standards. So it's not like they're going for the cheapest price. They want to maintain that brand and their reputation in that. And really good companies do that, is they'll audit their supply chain to make sure they're being, responsive to their requirements.
Aaron says, compliance must be followed by law, but is an instinct for ethics a muscle that can be strengthened?
Yes, absolutely. Who is this Aaron person anyway?
I don't know.
That's my daughter. But yes, it has to be. And it gets to the issue of raising consciousness, raising a sense of awareness of issues out there. And it's got to become part of your DNA. So compliance, we can look it up. It's in the book. We must do this, that, and something else. The code of conduct, you can look it up. It's online, probably. We must follow these things. But ethics are the extra legal things that we should be thinking about. How it impacts all stakeholders, not just employees, not just customers, but the supply chain, the regulators, your relationship with the regulators, the community writ large, and so forth. And so can it be strengthened? Yes. I think it needs constant attention, like anything. It's not just a one time. Culture, I've long said, is not a 6-month rollout. It's forever. It's forever. And culture embodies ethics. And so it must continuously be tended to. I saw a company some years ago that I was working with, and they had to go through an entire transformation. They paid a huge price for bribery and corruption worldwide, and got a new CEO in. He set up a whole new senior management team, and said, here are the values we're going to hold each other accountable to. And we're going to do this once a week. Every week, we're going to talk to each other. And then they came up with a system where, and I'll call it an attaboy, attagirl system, where when you opened up your computer in the morning, on the screen, somebody was being congratulated in one of the factories around the country, around the world. Mary, thank you for doing what you did. That's a real safety improvement for us. And I got to tell you, we're really thrilled. And then 15 other people would get on and say the same thing, reinforcing that behavior. The CEO would come in and say, Mary, that's great. Here's a little bonus check for you. Go and, whatever you can do to reinforce the positive nature. Look, I'm Dr. Doom. Anybody who knows me, I know every scandal that happened in the last 45 years. And so you want to talk to me about the doomsday scenarios. I know all of them. I've worked with a lot of them too, by the way. But the one that gets most currency is reinforcing the good, and that becomes embedded in the culture of organizations.
I love that, because that's what, when you give a dog a treat, you give them a treat when they shake your paw, when they shake and all of that stuff. But it reminds me of a meeting planner that came to an event I spoke at a couple of years ago, and she does a employment fair kind of an event, and it was a couple of days long, and she was asking everybody there, so it had potential employees and then employers that were hiring, but asked about dietary needs. And every meal function, she said everyone was really diligent and asked to pick up their plates, and her numbers were on the mark. She said, but on the last night where they were having dinner with their most promising employer or employee, right, no one requested their personalized plates. And she's like, how do I take that and manage that? And to me, hearing that story is like the potential employees were scared to share who they were and be transparent with that by potentially letting someone know that they have a potential disability or something that might put a red flag on their resume. Right. But I also suggested to her, hey, let's talk to these employers and teach them to talk about their culture.
That's right.
So that they talk about, hey, we welcome people of all race and creed and sex and gender, and people who have dietary restrictions or people who have different religious beliefs. We welcome them in, so that it's a communication about their culture without asking them, do you have any disabilities?
Yeah, totally. I totally agree with that. I mean, it's a hardship. People feel like they're going to be disqualified from their job opportunity if they disclose it, right. And the company will see it as a potential liability if something goes wrong with me and the foods I ingest. And so, but a company that turns that around and proactively promotes, safe foods, safe work conditions, everything else, to me, that's got to be applauded. That's really a necessity.
Well, and I think, and it goes to show that I'm like, hey, if you have a wheat allergy and you're applying for a job for a bread manufacturer, you must say that, hey, I can't be on the floor. I want to work just in the corporate office, right? So, and I think that's important for companies to communicate that information too, because even, hey, if you have a wheat allergy, you can still work with us, right? You can still have this kind of be part of our culture in this fashion versus being on the floor and making the bread.
Sure.
Okay. So we are at almost 40 minutes. Wow. I could talk to you about this for a long time. And do you have any resources that you can share with us that HR manufacturers, HR people can look to, or meeting planners as well on compliance and ethics?
Sure. My expert is my daughter, Erin, who has become, as you know, Tracy, a bona fide expert. She testifies before the FDA and before the Congress on these issues and so forth, and has provided remarkable leadership to the whole issue of food allergies. I'm so proud of her. She, as you know, did a PSA regarding food allergies, and she won an Emmy for it. So
I know, I'm so excited about that.
Which is great. So her organizations are Allergy Schmalergy, SHMALLERGY, and Allergy Strong. And there's a mountain of information there. She's writes prolifically, blogs, etc. there's so much useful information there that anybody who's interested, I would urge them to contact her or go on her website and look up the information. But if I ever have a question about this, I pick up the phone and say, Erin, help me. I don't know what I'm doing. And she's terrific. So.
No, she is wonderful. And she was actually the first person on my podcast.
There you go. Okay.
Yes. She's quite knowledgeable and I love what she does. And Erin, I put schmallergy, I forgot to put the word allergy before it, but the link to both of her websites are right now in the feed.
Okay, good.
So if anybody wants to reach out to her as well. And I know I asked you this question about, but I do ask everybody, what's your favorite food or beverage?
Well, there was pre-diabetes and there was post-diabetes. So pre-diabetes, I ate everything under the sun that was not good for me. And I couldn't understand how I gained 30 pounds. But I mentioned Entenmann's crumb cake, where I would chop off just the top so I got the crumbs and not the rest of it. And all the junk food, nacho cheese flavored Doritos. I would have orange fingers and orange lips after a while. So all of that stuff. And then when I got diagnosed and my A1C was off the charts, it was 13.7, which is wow. My eyesight was going it was very serious. And I immediately went on the Atkins diet, lost 30 pounds, and my A1C is 5.6. So everything is in great shape. But today, what are my favorite foods? Food has become functional for me. So literally, it's to put some protein in my system. So I may have eggs in the morning because I can have eggs and bacon that has 0 carbohydrates. Lunch, frequently I'll just have a sandwich or just plain deli meat. Last night, my wife and I went out to our local hamburger place. I have a hamburger, no bun, some broccoli because she insists I need greens. And I agree with her. Chicken wings and so forth. Mm-hmm. But I really, and I'm not perfect, obviously. You got to cheat every once in a while. But so my foods today are really much more functional because I have to manage them for my health. As Miles has to, as anybody who's got food issues. So, and it doesn't bother me. Once you let go of those other things that you used to do, the bad habits with food, it becomes part of your daily life. It's that simple. So, that's life for me.
Well, I think you have a good life. You've taught us a lot today. I appreciate it. And it's ethics and compliance it's a touchy subject, and it's a hard thing to work through, I think, in some cases. But I think, with the mindset of having integrity and working towards being inclusive for everyone and having just good business practices, like you said, let's reinforce the good.
Sure.
And not the bad. Yeah, exactly. Well, this is the Eating at a Meeting podcast, and you can also catch us on every podcast platform under Eating at a Meeting. Please let your friends know. We also have an Eating at a Meeting Facebook group that you can join, where we talk about and educate on eating at a meeting, all things food and beverage. So thanks everybody for being here, and we will see you next week. Thanks for listening to the Eating at a Meeting podcast, where every meal matters. I'm Tracy Stuckrath, your food and beverage inclusion expert. Call me and let's get started right now on creating safe and inclusive food and beverage experiences for your customers, your employees, and your communities. Share the podcast with your friends and colleagues at our Eating at a Meeting Facebook page and on all podcast platforms. To learn more about me and receive valuable information, go to tracystuckrath.com. And if you'd like more information on how to feed engagement, nourish inclusion, and bolster your bottom line, then visit eatingatameeting.com.